Ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the BlockCrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. This episode is also brought to you by PARASWAP. Stick around to learn more. This episode is also sponsored by the Hbar Foundation. This episode is also brought to you by notional.finance. I like to use notional.finance to get transparent, fixed-rate borrowing and lending on Ethereum. The upgraded and easy-to-use V2 with token and liquidity mining is also live now at notional.finance/BlockCrunch. So stick around to learn more. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the BlockCrunch podcast. Now this year, DAOs is a huge theme with so many more DAOs popping up everywhere. However, governance has still been a challenge in terms of incentivizing people to vote and also getting people to work for DAOs. So I have me here, a friend of mine, Jacob Phillips, a crypto researcher at Polychain Capital, and he has a lot of really interesting thoughts about how DAOs should be leveraging human capital. And he wrote a really, really interesting blog post recently that I'm going to link to in the show notes below about mining human capital. So to discuss this idea as well as how DAOs can scale, I'm really excited to have Jacob on the show today. So Jacob, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Excited to be here.
Definitely. Now, just to get us started, can you walk us through a little bit about how you got into this space and what got you excited about specifically DAOs?
Yeah, for sure. So the story goes back to, I went to school at Case Western in Cleveland. And when I was there, I was mostly doing finance work, did a couple summers in banking. And about halfway through that second summer, I was sitting there making, pitch decks and formatting Excel spreadsheets, and sort of thought to myself, there had to be something more out there. And I had just started a CS major the semester before. So I started diving into venture a little bit, thinking maybe that would be a good place for me to end up, and was talking with a lot of different venture firms, like trying to get some experience. Ended up at a small startup accelerator in Cleveland called Flash Starts, sort of like micro VC, did some SaaS accelerations before that. Happened to be launching a blockchain fund, not to my knowing at all. I just sort of got roped into it. Cleveland and a lot of the other kind of post-industrial Midwest cities were all launching these like blockchain movements at the time. This was like late 2018 after the big bull run. And I was sort of like forced to sit down and look at the tech then. I had run into crypto a number of times before, but at that time I was trying to become a fundamental stock investor. And so there weren't a lot of like fundamentals in crypto, I think like 2016, 2017, even early 2018 in a sense, or at least not that I could see. So I sort of like pushed away as much as I could. At some point, like by, winter 2018, it was almost like contrarian enough. This is when like Bitcoin and ETH were hitting all-time lows, that it was just contrarian enough, I think, for me to get back in. So I ended up kind of that winter, sort of in December, deciding I was going to go into crypto full-time. Just started like pinging all the funds in the space I could find. Ended up getting like a remote part-time unpaid internship for a guy running a crypto fund out of Houston, and then used that to land Ariana Simpson before she was at A16Z, had her own fund. So I went and interned for her that fall, and then came out and joined Polychain at the beginning of 2020. And yeah, I've been with Polychain for about 2 years. I started off mostly working on the liquid side. Now I've basically spent all my time on the venture side, and then I do some governance work as well. And how I got into governance, it's actually funny. When I was working for Ariana, like one of the projects she had me do was work on a proposal for the Zcash dev fund proposals way back when. Like, I don't know that I had any particular interest in governance then. And not that Zcash is like a DAO per se, but governance comes in many different forms. And that was kind of my first foray into it. When I joined Polychain, I ended up chatting with the Polychain Labs guys and Rob Widoff, who were like running, I think at the time, the biggest Tezos baker. So there was some governance work I kind of like collaborated with them on a little bit. And then I ended up when DeFi summer really kicked off and governance became like super, super important, because if we sort of didn't help the governance of these networks, like maybe didn't progress potentially as large token holders, I started getting more and more involved. And I don't think we don't have a formal governance lead internally, but I think that I'm one of sort of two guys on the team, I think, who spends a decent chunk of our time working on this. And I don't know, DAOs are interesting because it's sort of like, I think it's cool because someone like myself, even without a lot of like traditional startup experience or having kind of done this before, can hop in and add value just by sort of like doing the homework enough to be able to say some intelligent things on a governance forum. So that's how I think I kind of got into it. And since then, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and all these names you're mentioning are bringing back a lot of memories with Tesos Bakers and Zcash.
Yep,
Obviously, since then the space has changed a ton, right?
totally.
And I think you proposed this really interesting idea recently on this blog post that I think is pretty bold, but maybe obvious to some, which is that DAOs, instead of mining liquidity, which is massive now in DeFi, should instead mine human capital. So before we kind of dive into the nitty gritty of how to actually implement that, can you explain to us what does that mean exactly? What does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you framed that right. It's obvious in principle, but perhaps not completely obvious in practice, in a sense that um, liquidity mining was kind of obvious before Compound, but it wasn't really until Compound launched in summer 2020 that it really opened everyone's eyes to what this could be. So, the concept of mining has been around for a long time, dating back to Bitcoin mining, proof of work miners to secure the protocol. And it's this like extremely powerful coordination mechanism. And when Compound launched in summer 2020 and DeFi summer really kicked off, we sort of reconsidered what mining might be. We had really only seen it before in the context of like mining people to secure the network on like a layer one level. And now we were thinking about it like, okay, well, what if now that we don't need security because we're all smart contracts on a chain, what if we use that instead to mine liquidity? And then the whole idea of mining, I think, got generalized a little bit just to like distributing tokens in exchange for some protocol service that's fundamental to whatever the protocol or application is. So one of the things, though, I think that is pretty apparent in the aftermath of Compound, Uniswap DAO launches, and a lot of the sort of failures of liquidity mining experiments rather, we saw in kind of DeFi summer was that liquidity mining isn't a golden ticket to success. And a lot of these protocols, while you can launch them and liquidity mine, get a lot of liquidity and sort of like early usage, this isn't necessarily going to put them at a sustainable rate for the long term. And what I really see missing, or I think that what I see and what a lot of people have kind of noticed is that at the end of the day, like these DAOs are people first and foremost, and these products that they're managing are, sort of unfinished, call it like, V.5 or maybe V1 of what will ultimately be probably 5 or 6 iterations before you get to something that's like in final form, in the same way that like a layer one that launches a protocol isn't in final form at day one. You're going to have to be able to like iterate in advance to keep up with the state of the art. So we need to like keep advancing these protocols, but it's really hard to do when you don't have a good governance system in place. So the idea behind governance mining was like, what if we took that, like the same level of excitement? Like if you look back to DeFi summer 2020, it was like absolutely insane. Generational wealth was being, it was like every week someone new was getting like generationally wealthy. People were like quitting their jobs to go focus full time on liquidity mining. It was just insane. Like the amount of excitement in the air. People were staying up all night. The idea behind governance mining was like, what if we took that same excitement and enthusiasm and applied that, instead of people just pooling money into a contract like liquidity mining, what if we instead applied that excitement to governance activity or just governance in general? It's a little bit harder to do, I think, than liquidity mining. Like the beautiful part about liquidity mining is it's so simple. But if we could do this, I think it'd be extremely powerful for these DAOs. And frankly, I think that like in a lot of ways right now, DAOs are just kind of, they're not doing a lot. Like in a lot of ways, they sort of hold projects back, I think, due to poor structure and inability, I think, to bootstrap from kind of day one. But governance mining in a lot of ways, if it works properly, could be a way to really speed these up. So that way, you launch a protocol, you have like some governance base and some amount of contributors, but you could 10x that on day one by launching a governance mining program that, brings a ton of excitement about governing the protocol, which is usually viewed as I don't know that governance is the most sexy activity in DeFi, but if people started getting really rich off it, making a lot of money and being compensated super well for the work they did, I think a lot of that narrative would shift.
Yeah, I tend to agree here because I think in this space in crypto, there's always this contention between should things be completely decentralized from day one, or should there be progressive decentralization, right? A group of kind of a group of centralized holders or actors basically pushing a protocol forward and then eventually decentralizing. And oftentimes in the first case, when protocols are completely decentralized from day one, it's very hard to incentivize anyone to do anything because there's no one major holder. And it
Right.
seems like this kind of mining of human capital is something that makes a lot of sense here. And I think some projects are already starting to do something similar with projects like Gitcoin putting out bounties for different projects, or this platform called Coordinate, which allows people to kind of put out different tasks and different bounties for different tasks. Is that essentially what governance mining is in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it follows the same level, the same sort of ideal or same sort of general premise, but maybe isn't quite the same. Coordinate would be a great tool for governance mining. Gitcoin might be considered a little bit different, but again, at the end of the day, this is all kind of semantics. The core idea behind governance mining is that people are your most valuable resource, and we should incentivize contributors at all costs. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. Um, I think when I think of like what separates a mining program from just like payment to contributors or some sort of bounty system is that there's like a size and scope of mining and sort of maybe a continuity that sort of goes above and beyond what you typically see. When I think of governance mining, a lot of like the way I sort of mentally picture it is it's like you get paid some amount for some service that you're doing, but then you get like this massive bonus on top. And that's really the mining part. The mining part is like, hey, we're going to pay, you know, 3x our typical contributor acquisition cost to like bootstrap a contributor base, basically to like hyper incentivize you to come join the network and contribute. And then hopefully, you know, over time, that'll kind of like lock you in. Um, yeah, the difference would be the difference between like a bounty system and I think like general payment here and this is that there's like a much larger scope that governance mining would entail here. I mean, I think it'd be similar to the difference between you know, paying someone for their hardware costs in proof of stake security versus, you know, truly pouring out, you know, 10 or 15% of inflation to sort of like really incentivize people to run nodes. Um, or another way to put it maybe is that like I think synthetics liquidity mining is actually a pretty good example of this because it's like you know, there was a lot of similar to what synthetics was in the early days. It was like synthetics was a really complicated system, and there was a lot of risk associated with being an LP that not a lot of people understood, and so they used liquidity mining, basically like pointing inflation at LPs of the protocol in order to like bootstrap that early liquidity. And had they not had that additional incentive on top of whatever fees you might earn as a liquidity provider to incentivize people to come in, you might not have ever seen liquidity pick up there. You sort of needed that like extra incentive to make to like allow people to kind of like take that leap of faith and actually do the work needed to be able to comfortably LP. I think it's the same way with being a contributor. Like pick any one of these protocols. They're very complex. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of historical information that you have to read up with to be able to get to a point where you can like properly contribute to this. Especially as a non-technical contributor for sure. As a technical contributor, like there's even a bigger hurdle I think to get up to speed to be able to contribute. Without these governance mining incentives, I don't think that people are finding the like kind of the like wages and bounty fees that people can extract from protocols valuable enough to like make it worth their time to you know, take time out of their day or to reallocate time from elsewhere to these protocols. So that's where I think like governance mining really comes in. Coordinate is kind of an interesting one because this actually ends up being like a really great tool that governance mining programs can use. Coordinate is just it falls under this category of tools that's like a contributor reward tool. It basically says, you know, you have a ton of contributors out there. You need to figure out how to reward them, and it's not obvious how to do this at scale. With smaller groups, you can sort of like pretty easily tell, like, okay, like if you were only rewarding 5 contributors, it'd be easy to say like who's contributing and to what degree. But when you're managing, 50, 60, 100, or even like potentially 1,000 or something like that longer term, it becomes a whole hell of a lot harder. So Coordinape, and then the other one that comes to mind that's in the piece is SourceCred. Both of these try to create a more algorithmic contributor reward tool. They use different mechanisms, but the logic's fairly similar. It basically creates some sort of like algorithmic way to reward contributors. And what's interesting about this is that it's there's no like one tool I think that's best for like governance mining distributions or just like rewarding contributors in general. Index actually does like a pretty killer job with how they think about rewards, and they basically layer things on top. So SourceCred is purely algorithmic. You basically like input all of the different, you basically create an equation that rewards contributors, and based on the data that then gets funneled back into the equation, you get rewarded. It's like, can scale to any number of contributors. It's really great, but it doesn't do a great job of like rewarding things that are, it does a really great job of rewarding the long tail of contributors. That's kind of what it's really good at. And so they use that to, they throw some portion of their contributor rewards to that every month or whatever. And that, that's designed to scale to all community members. Then you have like sort of this middle tier that's designed to contribute sort of like part-time / like partially involved contributors. And for that, they use Coordinape. So this is like a little bit less scalable than SourceCred, but still does a pretty good job of distributing rewards across like a large number of people. And then for like core contributors or people like really driving the most value, this is where things get a whole lot more nuanced, and you sort of need like human interaction to be able to decide like what is the proper salary or incentive we should attach to this. And for that, they use something similar to like a board of directors or like a core unit lead. And this, I think, is just it's a really beautiful way, I think, of thinking about contributor rewards, because you're able to, incentivize the whole scale of contributors, using a couple different methods.
So it sounds like you're making a distinction between contributors, which are basically, they sound like freelancers, right? People who are just brought on for specific tasks through these bounty platforms like Gitcoin, Coordinape, or SourceCred. And then also core contributors, which are more like a company's full-time employees. So you need to give them like employment contracts. You need a board of directors to really oversee them. So when you talk about mining human capital and governance mining, are you mostly thinking of DAOs needing to be more aggressive in onboarding freelancers, or are you thinking more in terms of these core contributors, these full-time employees?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's probably a mix of both. My hope with governance mining is that this is a way that people can convert freelancers and part-time contributors into core contributors. So I think it would be a little bit more of the latter. I don't think of this as much as task-based work. That's what I would. So I guess in contrast to the bounty system, I would hope that governance mining would evolve into something more sustainable than that. Because if all it is task-based work, then what you probably end up with is something similar to liquidity mining, where people come in, they provide liquidity for some period of time, but they're not really locked in. When liquidity mining rewards end, they dip and go elsewhere. I think that there's still value in having this kind of bounty system governance mine, because somebody comes in and completes a bounty, they've now permanently improved the protocol. Like, this is good. That's like long-term value created by this governance mining program. Like on the other hand, at the end of the day, like what really will drive long-term value is bringing in full-time contributors who will then do things for the protocol that not only have like it's not only them completing some small task, it's like them getting involved in the protocol and governance full time, and then working on some like 1.5 or 2-year project that like doubles or triples the value of the protocol. Like, that's what I think is really bullish for governance mining, is that it's a way of attracting contributors to get involved with the protocol, maybe first through a task, but then ultimately in a deeper, more meaningful way that allows them to like really drive long-term value for the protocol.
Now, before I continue, I'd love to share one of my favorite products in crypto with you. Now, whenever I want to trade a token, instead of going to Uniswap, SushiSwap, Bancor one by one to see where I can find the best quote, I just go to PARASWAP to scan for the best price anywhere. Because PARASWAP aggregates all the popular Ethereum dexes and saves me a ton of time and headache in finding where I can trade something for the best price, and lets me trade in one place. Now, the cool thing is they've also integrated with Ledger Live as well, meaning I can now swap at the best prices directly from my Ledger wallet. So seriously, if you're a DeFi trader and you're worried about the security risks of centralized exchanges, but you also don't want to scour dozens of dexes just to find the best price, you have to check out PARASWAP. So head on over to paraswap.io/blockcrunch. I'd also love to take a moment to talk about the Hbar Foundation. Now, if you approached me 1 to 2 years ago, I would tell you I'm really skeptical of layer 1 systems outside of Ethereum. But in the past 12 months, I started to notice billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of users flocking to new blockchains left and right. And then I realized there's an actual market gap being filled. And I always love to support projects who support builders. And one of those projects is Hedera Hashgraph. Hedera is an enterprise-grade public network with its own crypto asset called Hbar. And the Hbar Foundation has launched with an initial budget of over $2 billion to provide entrepreneurs with the funding and ecosystem support needed to quickly build and deploy new applications on the Hedera Hashgraph network. The Hbar Foundation is eager to find builders in DeFi, NFTs, gaming, sustainability, and all sectors. So if you are a builder, a developer, or a creator with an idea, visit hbarfoundation.org to learn more.
I'd love to talk a little bit about Notional. If you followed the show for long enough, you know I'm pretty excited about fixed-rate products. Notional.finance is the leading fixed-rate borrowing and lending protocol, and they've just released a major upgrade. With Notional, you can not only borrow and lend at fixed rates for up to 1 year now, but liquidity providers also have a pretty good opportunity. Thanks to an integration with Compound and a liquidity mining program, LPs can actually earn interest, liquidity fees, and token liquidity mining incentives as well. We've talked with Teddy from Notional recently, and as a happy investor as well, I've been pretty impressed with how the team is building this critical infrastructure that will help onboard the next billion users to DeFi. So you can check it out today at notional.finance/blockcrunch.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying makes a lot of sense, but at the same time, when you look at what's kind of actually happening, it seems like DAOs are on the stingy side. And I think you mentioned this in your blog as well. You said that DAOs should be the highest paying shops on the block, but they're usually really stingy when it comes to, incentivizing people to actually contribute value. But surprisingly, very, very generous when it comes to just giving away free money for liquidity mining to bump up their total value log, to bump up the metrics. So why do you think they're so stingy? And is this a solvable problem?
Yeah, I definitely think it's solvable. I think the reason that DAOs are probably stingy right now is because it's not always easy to decide what people should be paid for these kind of services. Like the community of token holders, they're not capital allocation experts or experienced capital allocators. They're not they like few of them have probably ever had experience like determining someone's salary or doing some sort of like figuring out what an incentive bonus should be or how to structure any sort of like contract like this. And people are like very deeply emotionally attached to these DAOs, and they don't want to be taken advantage of. They don't want to like misallocate funds. I mean, I think it's a combination of like not enough experience with this kind of thing, and probably not enough research done to really understand like what the market rate is for this, and not enough capital allocation experience, I think, to fully grasp like the supply and demand situation at hand that causes this like work to be so incredibly valuable. And then that attached to sort of like emotion, where I don't think it's like necessarily a mistake. Like it's a good thing, I think, that people push back. And like when I say stingy, I think that this is like it's like a little bit of an emotionally charged word where I think it should be something different, but it's honestly a good thing. Like it's the opposite of this would be DAOs like wasting money, and that would be much worse than being stingy. But the other thing that's interesting is that it might not only be a community thing. I think also like part of the reason that DAOs appear to come off as stingy is because contributors who work for DAOs, they either like a lot of times they're either not asking for payment for the work they do, or they're asking for payment that's like well below what they probably could argue they're worth. And part like I think that a lot of DAO contributors right now are just sort of like working for reputation, and they've accepted this because they know that they're not going to get paid enough, and like this, or they don't want to look like they're in it for the money or like look a little scummy. This idea that like contributors asking for big sums of money for the work they do for these protocols is like a bad thing or is looked down upon in any way by the community. Like this is a meme that I hope goes away in 2022. This is something I personally want to destroy. Larry and Derek from Reverie, Compound just went through with this proposal to onboard Open Zeppelin as an auditor for the for any of the community developers within the Compound community. And Larry and Derek, who sort of like led a lot of the work to sort of talk to different auditors and run a process, and then ultimately sort of help negotiate some of the terms with like Open Zeppelin and Trailbits and others. They then attached like a 75K fee to the proposal, and I sort of like, after a while, I can't remember, I think the proposals had just been submitted and nobody was like even arguing about the cost. Think about it, 75K. I don't know exactly how long Larry and Derek like spent doing this, but it wasn't like a ton of time, but it was very high value work. So that's why kind of the fee was merited. But nobody was really arguing with this, which is so not typical. Anytime any contributor puts a fee for their work, there's always pushback, especially a fee of this amount. And I said something like, whoa, oh my gosh, is no one going to bitch about the price tag on this proposal? Like, so proud of you, comp community. We're making progress. And it was, again, like a little bit, I wish I wouldn't have said it with that tone, but the logic behind that was basically like, thank God. I mean, I hope that people look at this and they're like, wow, I can make 75K. I mean, for some people, I hope that there's some like college kids right there looking at that, like, man, if I can go out and do valuable work for a DAO, like I can earn a year's salary in, in like a couple weeks or something like that. That's really what I think that governance mining is really all about. It's showing people that DAOs will pay up for good work that adds value to the protocol, and this will lead to a flood of new contributors into the ecosystem. Right? It's almost like I really wish that there was a way that all of the like DAOs could get together and coordinate and do like one mass like crypto community governance mining program where they all like pool some funds together, and like just if you contribute to any governance, you'll get like some like bonus on top of that, and we would just like bring like hundreds of new like protocol governors into the ecosystem full time. That would be really cool, but I don't know that is necessarily feasible, but that's sort of like the logic behind a lot of this.
And to kind of put it in more specific, to be more specific about it, how much do you think contributors should be paid in general? It sounds like that 75K figure made sense for that specific instance, but in general, is there a price range that DAOs that are listening to this show should be thinking about in terms of rewarding contributors?
Yeah, another good question. It's hard to say, and I'm not going to say that I'm even an expert on this. I said that one of the reasons that I think that sometimes DAOs come off as stingy is because the community of token holders isn't experts on allocating money, or they don't really know how much like these people should be paid. I'm in the same boat with a lot of this stuff, right? I'm not saying that 75K was the like proper amount, but I think it was at least in the right ballpark, right? At the end of the day, like what I hope that DAOs will do is give contributors an opportunity to capture the value that they create. And for a lot of these DAOs, like you look at Comp or Uniswap or basically any of these big DeFi DAOs, you're talking about multi-billion-dollar protocols with a very small number of contributors. So for a contributor to come in and do anything, anything valuable. I mean, if you, I don't know, if you come in and propose a protocol upgrade, moves that adds value to the protocol such that like over the long term, this moves the token price by even like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, not even considering like what it would look like if you did something that like doubled the protocol value. Like you're creating a ton of like value for the protocol, and you should be able to capture that. Like these DAOs are in theory, some of the highest leverage places that developers and protocol contributors could be giving their time, but DAOs don't pay up and let people capture that value. A lot of times when DAOs are paying out fees, they are thinking more about it in terms of like the cost of the labor, and not capturing some portion of the value created. And that's the one thing that sort of sort of drives me nuts. And that's where I felt like, that sort of 75K fee for the work they did, that like whole, onboarding Open Zeppelin as an auditor. This was in the aftermath of Compound having sort of like a buggy upgrade. Now we have an auditor on hand who will hopefully help prevent any sort of like security vulnerability going forward. That is worth way more than 75K, and of course we're paying Open Zeppelin, so it turns out to be a lot more than 75K, but I think you get the point here. It's really hard to say exactly how much it is, but I hope that DAOs will start thinking about this more in terms of the value rather than like the cost of labor.
Yeah, I think thinking about it in terms of value created is a framework that makes a lot of sense. I guess the tricky part would probably be, how do you determine how much value has been made? I guess you could look into other projects to see maybe historically what similar contributions have done to those projects. Would you say that's maybe one way to do it?
Yeah, probably. That's probably your best bet. And yeah, to your point there, we may not know exactly what the value created is. And so what you might have to do is, sort of like make a guess, or at least in the near term here, we'll give you like some payment for the work you did. But then over time, this is one of the other cool parts about governance mining, is in theory, you could sort of have a retroactive distribution such that this is actually like, this idea kind of comes from how SourceCred does their distribution. Let's say in, January of this year, you propose a protocol upgrade that nobody thought was going to be valuable. You get like very little payment for it. But then in December of this year, everybody realizes that like, holy shit, this totally changed the game. This makes our protocol 2x more valuable. You could then receive like an outsized portion of the governance mining rewards in December for your work back in January. So it's sort of like you can look back on work in the past that was valuable and find ways to reward it. That might be a good way to do it. But actually, Jason, one other thought on this is that the other way that we can sort of like think about how much contributors should be paid is this ends up being a little bit of a game of supply and demand. I mean, it's not all that different from how like venture rounds are priced in venture capital. You sort of have like someone proposes something initially. If other offers come up, then the price moves around a little bit, and ultimately we like choose one based on these different ranges. And I assume that like as more contributors come into the space, I think that prices will probably adjust upward relative to the value for like the value they're contributing. But ultimately, like competition also always moves prices down. So the classic case of this is actually that we were just chatting about this a little bit, I think, over Telegram, was GFX coming in and helping out with the Ferrari upgrade, and then asking for a $3 million fee on top of that. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, it seems extremely pricey at first, but when you kind of break into it, it's really not all that absurd. Like, for one, GFX is kind of incentivized to throw out some fee and kind of have it negotiated down. Another thing, there are very few, if any, other parties who were well positioned to be able to step in and do the work that they did, right? So from a supply and demand perspective, in theory, they could kind of ask for whatever they wanted, right? And frankly, I think that like the value of the work probably even exceeds whatever that payment was. I thought the protocol was like, or the proposal was really well researched, and I mean, I think it's pretty cool to have like a group like them basically, working on two different projects kind of on the side, like a full-time startup there, dropping everything to spend a week on like governance for another couple of protocols doing M&A. Like, that's pretty cool to me. Perhaps they should have been rewarded with something, but I didn't review the code and the exact proposal in enough detail, I think, to really be able to comment on the quality of it. But I do think that there is like this kind of thing, I don't think is as outlandish as it may seem. And, to some of the points I was making earlier, had you paid $3 million for a couple weeks of work, like, that's only so bullish, I think, for what the future of contributor participation in your protocol looks like. Hell, I think if that kind of payment, if that size of payment had been done for that style of work, or in Ferrari or in any other protocol, I mean, I think you'd instantly see people leaving their jobs to go become full-time DAO contributors.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was actually one of the people who were opposed to that fee when I first saw that. And for listeners, just to give some context here, Jacob's referring to this merger between two massive DeFi protocols, Fe and Hbar protocol, and a service provider called GFX basically came in and helped structure that merger and then proposed that they should be paid $3 million. And I was one of the people who had this knee jerk reaction and thought, wow, $3 million for what seemed like 2 weeks of work seems like a lot. But I agree, there's a lot of merit to be thinking about things in terms of value created versus the cost of labor or the time cost. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about what DAOs are not doing correctly now. But have you seen any DAOs that are actually doing kind of governance mining or incentivization correctly? Because one thing that I think was kind of maybe a little bit disappointing is looking at DeFi 1.0 projects and a lot of founders kind of stepping down and stepping back and exiting the community, which I guess was the original goal. But then, it seems like some of them kind of take a backseat role and aren't as active in governing the direction of the protocol. And as such, the community doesn't really have anyone to kind of gravitate towards, which I guess is the natural end goal for a lot of DAOs to be completely decentralized. But at the same time, that comes at the cost of no one really at the helm. So have you seen any DAOs that do that balance between decentralization and incentivizing a community or rallying the community correctly? Any good examples that people can look to?
Totally. Yeah. I think people who do it right are people like Maker and Index and Yearn and Sushi. And interestingly, I guess with the exception of Maker, most of these, like, part of the reason I think that they have evolved to do it in the right way is because they sort of started from, like, a lot of these protocols that have really good governance started from a DAO first model where contributor or like the core team isn't thought of as like one big unit. They're sort of thought as like a collection of individual contributors. And in a similar way to how like, Compound Labs or Uniswap Labs is really just like a collection of people, each who have some, share in the comp token. But from a regulatory perspective, they're often treated as like one unit or like a centralizing force. So I do think, I wonder if longer term, a lot of these like upcoming DeFi protocols will find ways to sort of avoid being viewed as like an independent unit that is a centralizing force. And maybe there's ways that you could sort of walk the fine line of like like one company versus a group of contributors. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a little bit tough for a lot of these major DAOs in the way things have evolved. And I don't think it's like, when I look at how like Compound and Uniswap have evolved, it's not surprising to me that this is the case. And frankly, I think we'll probably see this happen more often, where founding teams are sort of inevitably like forced to distance themselves from the protocol for regulatory reasons. I do, however, I hope that we can find ways to work within the regulatory bounds to allow that founding team to stay involved somehow. Like, it's always tough when you take like a world-class team of contributors and then have them not be able to do the same kind of work they were doing a few months ago pre-protocol launch. DYDX, I think, has done a pretty good job so far dancing this line by sort of like setting up a foreign foundation or like a foundation outside the US, and then also having sort of a US-centric development co that can keep sort of working on the protocol, and sort of this, the dance of decentralization sort of plays out over time. That I think is good. The protocols that have done governance right so far are the ones who have maintained some sort of like some sense of strong leadership, right? So like Maker, I think, is like the poster child for this, which is kind of funny. Maker for the longest time was viewed as this like really bureaucratic organization. This was like before any projects were DAOifying. Everyone was like, oh, big bad Maker with their bad governance, whatever. And now you look at it and it's like, holy shit, Maker has like, I think they have 18 core units, and they pay out annual like compensation of something like $50 million versus some of these other DAOs that are like struggling to hire a single contributor. Like, it's insane. I was actually chatting with Mario Lal from Placeholder about this, and he like pointed out to me, interestingly, that Maker's bureaucracy is like this is a feature, not a bug. Like DeFi DAOs in a lot of ways want very like structured, organized, rules-based governance that allows them to function in in an efficient manner. It's sort of like the middle point between like Ethereum style, like total off-chain governance and like fully on-chain governance, is this like very, very bureaucratic on-chain governance that is like, there's like checks and balances so you don't run into security issues. If anything ever needs to get done, there's like a group who can step up to do this. This is ultimately, I think, how all DAOs are going to evolve, something closer to the maker model. And I think Index and Yearn have both are both situated very similarly to how Maker is, and I'm sure that you'll see a lot of the other DAOs that aren't there move that direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, then that $50 million number you throw out sounds astounding, but I guess that's how much it takes to maintain one of the most valuable and most important protocols in DeFi today. And just looking at the size of these treasuries, I think Uniswap has a liquid treasury of $3 billion. The total thing is like almost $8 billion now. And you see similar numbers in a lot of different projects, right? Compound has, I think, $45 million liquid. Aave has $480 million liquid. So there is a lot of money. But at the same time, I wonder if, a lot of this treasury value is because of the bull market, because a lot of tokens have appreciated, and whether something like aggressive governance mining is still possible in a bear market. Have you kind of thought about that as well? And any tips to DAOs out there in terms of how to make sure that incentives don't just fully rely on kind of market conditions and can become sustainable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the one way maybe to avoid that is when you're in a deep bull market, consider taking some cash off the table, sort of converting tokens into cash. That might be one way to do it. You're totally right. That like the initial initial vision for governance mining is very similar to liquidity mining, in that you're sort of like emitting tokens periodically, tokens that are worth whatever the market values them at, so it can fluctuate significantly. I think it probably means taking some money off the table just so you have a little bit of a buffer. I mean, this is good not just for governance mining, but just so you can pay contributors should we run into some sort of bear market. But it's tough. One of the other things I think that projects will probably start doing more and more is rather than going straight to a liquid ERC20 token where you are heavily exposed to the kind of like ups and downs in the market. It's possible we'll see more projects sort of stay like pseudo private for longer. Maybe not fully private, like they might do some like non-transferable NFTs or non-transferable governance tokens for a while as sort of like an intermediate step between full liquid market exposure and private no liquid exposure at all. This to me might be some way to sort of like avoid a lot of the market activity, in that if you do have a project where you're expecting to be like really building hardcore for the next 2 years, like some DeFi protocols you can launch today, have a product that's like pretty good, people can use, and everything's sort of like A-okay. You're like time from initial development to something that looks like product market fit could realistically be just on the order of months. Then maybe you don't need to do this. But for projects I think that are like a little bit longer term, really building for kind of 3 to 5 years out, it might make sense, instead of launching a liquid token 6 months into the project, really sort of buckling down and keeping things private. I just think like, crypto markets are so volatile that it can become a huge distraction. And that kind of thing of like, okay, what happens if the market turns? I think that projects who haven't launched tokens or don't have like a liquid ERC20 that they're watching the price of every day, I think that they're much less exposed to that kind of activity. But I don't know. I guess pray for no bear market also, but
Yeah, no, that's actually very in line with, things I tell founders all the time is, you don't have to have a token from day one, right? You can delay for as long as you need. And that's what some of the blue chip protocols out there have done, right? Uniswap didn't launch a token until the product is already basically a market leader. And I guess in terms of VCs, not to kind of justify my own existence here, but I think this is where VCs come in as well, because there's billions and billions of dollars raised in dirty fiat, and this is where DAOs can really reach out to VCs if they want to sell massive amounts of tokens for these treasury sales. And sure, they could try to sell to retails, but there's a lot of regulations involved in that, where it's much safer from a regulatory perspective to just kind of sell to private investors. But that's another conversation in and of itself. Definitely don't want to get into that here. Well, Jacob, it's been really fun to talk to you and learn more about how you're thinking about DAO contribution. In terms of people who want to maybe reach out to ask you questions or check out more of what you're working on, what are the best ways for them to reach out?
Yeah, sure. You can shoot me a note on Twitter or Telegram. Both my handles are Jacob P. Phillips. And yeah, I look forward to chatting with people. Jason, thanks a lot for having me on. What I left out of my journey getting into the crypto space is that when I was first getting in, I was listening to all kinds of podcasts, one of which was Block Crunch, and I used to go shoot hoops and just listen to like 3 or 4 podcasts on double speed, and Block Crunch was always, was definitely one of the more helpful ones. So it's come full circle here.
Yeah, I'm super glad to hear that, and really glad to have you on, man.
Definitely.